Human beings are stories they tell themselves, and then believe in so deeply that they treat those stories as destiny. If everything you know about yourself, your name, your nationality, your gender, your religion, your morality, your life's purpose, is merely the product of a chain of evolutionary coincidences, social compromises, and collective imaginations, then what is left when we peel away every single layer? What remains when we realize that Homo sapiens was not the first species of human, and quite possibly will not be the last? What remains when the truth we once thought was rock solid turns out to be nothing more than a fiction that enough people agreed to believe in, and therefore it became law? If every god, every religion, every state, every corporation, and even money itself is nothing more than an imagined structure sustained purely by collective faith, then where exactly is the line between a civilization and a dream that has simply lasted too long? The book you are about to hear does not treat history as a sequence of events that have already passed. It treats history as a distorted mirror, reflecting our present through layers of ironic, overlapping time. You do not need to prepare yourself to feel optimistic. You do not need to carry a value system to defend. You only need courage to ask questions. Even if the answers do not bring you peace, but instead bring you a sharp, unsettling clarity. This journey does not begin at the birth of the universe. It begins the moment a small, frail animal suddenly believed it was the center of the cosmos, and from that moment onward, it never stopped creating worlds, only to become disillusioned inside the very worlds it had made. We encourage listeners to buy and read the full book so you can experience its complete power. Only when you read the entire work will you truly understand the nature of the problem you are hearing me narrate right now. But for now, let us begin this summary together. Part 1: The Cognitive Revolution. Modern science can send humans to the moon, edit genes to cure diseases, or teach machines how to drive cars. But no one can pinpoint the exact moment when a species of primate on the African savanna learned how to tell stories. And that was the turning point that bent the course of human history forever. Not tools. Not fire. Language, not just to describe reality, but to invent things that had never existed before. Around 13.5 billion years ago, matter, energy, and time began to take shape in the universe. 4.5 billion years ago, Earth was formed. But it was only about 70,000 years ago that something truly bizarre happened. Homo sapiens, the wise human, suddenly did something no other species had ever done before. They began building a second world, a universe made entirely of stories. From that moment, history was no longer carved in stone. It was written in imagination. We were not the first humans on Earth. At least 6 species of humans once existed. Homo neanderthalensis and denisovans in Europe. Homo erectus in Asia. Homo soloensis in Java. Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores. Each lived in its own corner of the planet. No one could have predicted that the small, physically weak sapiens would be the last one standing. The big question is, why only sapiens survived? Not because we were stronger, Neanderthals had far superior physiques. Not because we had bigger brains, many other species had impressive brain sizes too. The secret lies in a silent revolution. The ability to imagine and to spread collective fictions. A group of 10 chimpanzees can live together peacefully. But you cannot put 100 chimpanzees in the same theater and expect them to cooperate. Sapiens can, as long as they all believe in the same story. That story could be about gods, about ancestors, about a joint stock company, anything. Whether it's a legend about a war god or the belief that a printed piece of paper has value, the magic lies in the ability to create and sustain a shared imagined reality. No other animal can do this. A monkey will never give you a banana today in exchange for a promise of 5 bananas next week. The cognitive revolution began with language, but not merely as a tool to describe a lion hiding behind a bush. It became the ability to say, that lion is the spirit of our ancestor. If we make an offering, our descendants will be protected. Lying stopped being deception. It became the foundation of society. That was also the beginning of gossip, a force of immense power. Homo sapiens knew who was sleeping with whom, who was trustworthy, who should be avoided. The ability to gossip became a survival skill. Those who told captivating stories gained more allies, more mates, and ultimately more descendants. Stories, in the end, turned out to be the most contagious genes of all. But the real power of our species was not just talking about the past or the present. It was the ability to convince thousands of people to believe in something that had never existed. They built tribes, religions, empires, all based on things no one could touch. Without mythology, there is no state. Without mythology, there is no money. The power of the Roman Empire, of Islam, of Google, of the US dollar, all are products of stories that millions of people believed in at the same time. This made sapiens extraordinarily flexible. They could cooperate with complete strangers. They could organize complex societies. They could adapt to any environment without needing biological evolution. A wolf takes thousands of years to become a dog. A sapiens can change belief in a single night and wake up the next morning as a completely different person carrying a completely different story. We began migrating out of Africa. Homo sapiens spread into the Middle East, then Asia, then reached Australia. The speed was astonishing. No other human species that had lived in those places for hundreds of thousands of years could adapt in time. Wherever sapiens set foot, the local ecology collapsed. They burned forests, hunted animals to extinction, and then told stories claiming their ancestors had granted them this land that once belonged to other species and other humans. In Australia, around 45,000 years ago, arrival was not just migration, it was a biological shockwave. Creatures that had survived millions of years of evolution, giant kangaroos, marsupial lions, 3-meter-tall flightless birds, vanished within a few millennia. Not because of an asteroid. Not because of melting ice. Because of humans, and the first spears thrown with the intent to survive. The same pattern repeated in the Americas. When the first groups crossed the Bering Land Bridge, they didn't just bring spears and tubers. They brought a refined imagination capable of designing mammoth traps or orchestrating campaigns to wipe out dangerous predators. Once again, the megafauna of the New World disappeared. The wild world you think of as a natural is actually a graveyard built on the footsteps of Homo sapiens. But not every migration was pure destruction. Alongside extinction came creation. Humans learned to survive in rainforests, deserts, flooded plains, ice, and even on the open sea. They invented new tools, studied the animals around them, and above all, they created countless stories to explain why they were there. A sheer cliff face was not just shelter, it could be the place where gods descended. A nocturnal predator was not just prey, it could become a sacred ancestral symbol. From here, the first myths were woven. No churches, no Bibles, but rituals, symbols, stories passed from generation to generation. Imagination was power, but it was also the map that guided humans through chaos. One troubling question arises: in a society without writing, without money, without formal government, how could dozens, hundreds, even thousands of people cooperate, hunt together, share food, and defend each other from enemies? The answer is still stories, blood oaths, rain-making ceremonies, ancestral laws. None of it was written in legal codes. It was etched into minds through ritual and tradition. A feast might be a time to share food, but it was also an occasion to reaffirm trust in the community. A storytelling session might be entertainment, but it was also the foundation of social structure. In such communities there was no rigid division of labor like in later agricultural societies. There was no professional class of storytellers, anyone could tell a story. A 10-year-old boy could stand up, tell a tale about the gods, and the elder would listen if the story was powerful enough. In that world, imagination was not just survival, it was real power. Yet strangely, even though large-scale cooperation was a tremendous achievement, sapiens maintained extremely flexible social structures. They could break away from an old group and form a new one in just a few days. No cities to be trapped in. No fields to defend at all costs. The only thing holding them together was relationships of trust built on stories and memory. This led to a breakthrough consequence: Homo sapiens could create decentralized social order. No need for kings or absolute leaders, just mutual agreement. Whether about the gods they worshipped or who should lead the next hunt, agreements did not require paperwork. They were driven by consensus, and that is what we now, thousands of years later, call belief in the system. One thing few people notice, from the very beginning, Sapiens' language was not only for transmitting information. It was for building reputation: who was trustworthy, who had lied, who was strong, who was weak but clever. That was the operating system of Sapiens society. In a society without archives, without bureaucracy, the whispers around the campfire were the original social network. You begin to realize something eerily similar to the modern world. Today's social media is merely an expanded version of those campfire tales from ancient caves. That a good story still spreads faster than truth. That an individual who knows how to tell stories can shake an entire community. That is why startups are called unicorns, imaginary creatures, why cryptocurrencies rely entirely on one thing: collective belief. Every time we communicate, invest, choose a leader, or even fall in love, we do not act based on absolute truth. We act based on the stories we believe are true. And that is the core of the cognitive revolution. Not that humans invented tools, they invented collective belief. Not that they knew how to hunt, they knew how to say the hunted animal had been granted by the gods. Not that they survived, they created entire worlds in order to survive inside them. Once Homo sapiens learned flexible large-scale cooperation through shared imagination, they also unlocked a new ability to record and transmit memory deliberately. No longer just drifting personal anecdotes, entire treasuries of knowledge passed purposefully from generation to generation. And astonishingly, they did this without writing. Imagine a community of more than 150 people. That is roughly the limit of direct personal relationships the human brain can maintain, Dunbar's number. Beyond that, social structures begin to fragment unless there is some support for collective memory. That is when stories began turning into symbols, rituals, and eventually myths. You no longer needed to remember every person's name, every debt, every complex relationship. It was enough to dance together around a sacred pole or retell what the ancestors did under the full moon to keep the communal memory alive. From here you can see why the earliest symbols, sun, moon, water, fire, animals, occupied the center of every ancient culture. They were not merely nature worship. They were collective data storage systems. A rock carved with a human face was not just art, it was a symbolic hard drive holding things language had not yet shaped: complexity, metaphor, emotion, mystery. Ironically, it was imagination that brought humans closer to what we call reality. While animals merely react to phenomena, sapiens began to speculate, plan, and imagine consequences. An elephant will never think, if I don't go to the water hole today, tomorrow I'll die of thirst. But a sapiens could look at cracked earth, at scorching sun, and tell others the story of the coming drought. And so stories were no longer just myths, they became survival maps. Whoever told the most useful story led. Whoever connected heaven, earth, and daily life earned trust. And from there, societies began to have people whose power came not from physical strength, but from connecting others through narrative. In some groups they became shamans, sacred storytellers, keepers of ancestral memory. They did not need to hunt or farm. Their role was to maintain the community's spiritual operating system. Without them, everything fell apart. This marks the first appearance of organized spirituality, where collective existence depended on shared belief in the invisible. And in that process, art was born. Cave paintings were not just aesthetic expression. They were attempts to shape shared memory. You drew a deer not because it was beautiful, but because you needed others to remember that deer moved with the seasons. You carved the sun not to worship it as a personal deity, but because you understood the sun signaled planting time, ancestral ceremonies, cycles of life. And if someone asked, "How do you know?" you told a story. And that story lived longer than any single life. However, when imagination grew too powerful, it also gave birth to delusion. Some groups began believing in the superiority of their bloodline, in being chosen, or in exclusive spiritual ownership of land. Those beliefs, though baseless, were strong enough to decide the life and death of thousands. A group of sapiens could wipe out another group simply because they believed their God had given them this land. And that reveals a terrifying truth: a story, once powerful enough, can kill. Indeed, no species on Earth has caused more mass extinctions than Homo sapiens. Not because of inherent evil, but because they could cooperate based on myth. A sapiens band that believed they were the chosen people could unite with ferocious intensity enough to exterminate anyone who did not share the same story. And so, from cave to battlefield, from ritual to massacre, one common denominator: collective stories. This forces us to ask, if society is built on imagination, where is truth? If money, gods, nations, even morality are woven from collective belief, then what in this world is real? The answer is not simple. But one thing is certain: the reality of sapiens is not defined by the physical world shared with other animals. It is defined by the psychological collective world. In our heads and in our relationships, everything is born and sustained. The world of Homo sapiens is therefore a strange world. Half physical reality: land, water, food, enemies, shared with other species. Half imagined reality, where laws, honor, and symbols are as alive as any beast. No elephant knows it belongs to Nation X. No dolphin believes it has a divine right to live. But a 6-year-old sapiens child can already fiercely distinguish thus from them, right from wrong, justice from betrayal, sometimes more fiercely than adults. That is why you should not be surprised when a group of people are willing to die for a flag, not for the cloth, but for the meaning they have assigned to it. That is the most vivid proof of the power of collective imagined realities. Once deeply etched into the mind, they cease being games, they become ideals worth living for. This gave sapiens the ability to cooperate on massive scales. But it also made them vulnerable to their own imagination. They could plunge into centuries-long wars just to control the interpretation of a sacred story. They could starve themselves believing that eating a certain food offends the gods. They could sacrifice entire generations for an ideal that had never been empirically proven. If we look back, almost every modern social system, from religion to nation-states, from corporations to law, is built on foundations that cannot be verified by the senses. Ask yourself, where is Apple Incorporated? Not in the headquarters building. Not in the iPhones. Not in the CEO or employees. All of those can vanish, and Apple can still exist. Apple exists only because millions agree that it exists and act accordingly. This is humanity's greatest leap. From biology to psychology. From instinctual reaction to living inside imagined structures. And thanks to that leap, they created things never before seen in nature: states, currencies, religions, constitutions, companies, NGOs. All are mental games, yet they control material life more powerfully than any natural force. What holds a nation of 100 million people together? Not force. Not factories. Not food. It is agreement on a story. We are one people, with a shared culture, laws, and territory, even if that story is built on more historical myths than objective facts. And if you still don't see the power of collective imagination, think of money. A small piece of paper worth 500,000 VND has no intrinsic use value. You cannot eat it, wear it, or build a house with it. But if society believes it has value, you can exchange it for food, clothing, shelter. If belief collapses, that paper becomes worthless trash. From the moment sapiens learned to tell stories, the world began operating not only by biological laws, but by symbolic laws. These symbols, whether a cross, a crescent, a corporate logo, or a national emblem, are the pillars of mental structures. And the fascinating thing is, almost none of us doubt their reality. We live, die, love, hate inside a world where physical truth is only a small part. You may find this disturbing, but it is the foundation of every great human invention. Without collective imagination there would be no universities, no global trade networks, no justice. All of them rest on belief in invisible concepts. What makes Homo sapiens special is not tool use: crows use sticks, not language; many species communicate, not cooperation; ants and bees have done it for millions of years. It is the ability to create and believe in things that do not exist, and then build the entire material world upon those non-existent things. We are not victims of imagination. We are its creators, its performers on our own stage. Part 1, The Cognitive Revolution, continued, deeper into social and symbolic structures. A scientist may spend his life decoding genes, not for the genes themselves, but because he believes in the concept of scientific truth. A lawyer may defend a client, not because of the physical facts alone, but because she believes in the rule of law. Both work not for things they can hold in their hands, but for invisible concepts that carry terrifying weight. If that is the case, then where is the boundary between myth and reality? That is where the cognitive revolution reaches its peak. The ability to live simultaneously in two worlds, one of objective physical reality, and one of collective subjective imagination. We do not have to choose one. We operate in both at the same time, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the cognitive revolution was not just an intellectual leap, it was a fundamental shift in how humans see the world, and how they see each other. When groups began believing in different imagined realities, the distance between communities grew wider. From unity based on blood ties and ethnicity, humanity moved toward division based on myths, symbols, and language. One group might believe they are children of the sun. Another might believe they are protected by a dragon god. From those myths came the division, us and them. And when they do not share the same system of imagination, they become a threat. Biologically, humans are 99.9% identical. But at the symbolic level, they can be completely different. That is not random. This imagined ecosystem creates culture, and culture is a gigantic classification machine. It decides who is kin, who is other, who is good, who is barbaric, all because they carry a different story in their heads. This division was both a driver and a danger. Thanks to it, humanity created incredible diversity, customs, beliefs, art, philosophies. But it is also why humans never stop arguing, and worse, why they fight, conquer, and massacre. Looking back at history, the most ferocious conflicts were not between different species, but between groups of sapiens carrying different myths. Sapiens could compete. But they only waged holy wars, crusades, jihads when sapiens fought sapiens, for honor, for gods, for empty promises of paradise. That is when history became soaked in blood. This does not mean imagination is the enemy. On the contrary, it is precisely thanks to imagination that humans could break through their biological limits. A weak man can defeat a lion if he believes in a sacred amulet and has 99 friends who share that belief. A small woman can convince hundreds to follow her deep into the forest if she tells a story convincing enough. Imagination is not just a survival tool. It is the lever of cultural evolution. And it is precisely in the space between truth and fiction that the first ethical systems were born. No other species asks, what is right? What is wrong? But Homo sapiens did, and they answered with stories. One tribe might believe killing is wrong, except when the victim is an enemy of their god. Another might believe sharing wealth is good, except when that wealth is a gift from ancestors and must not be given to outsiders. You see? Morality, law, honor, all were not programmed in DNA. They were programmed through stories repeated so often that no one dared question them. And when someone broke the pattern, they were not punished for the act itself, but for shaking the collective story. That is why the first people who doubted the gods or questioned social order were seen as heretics, traitors, dangers. They did not just go against the crowd, they threatened the very core of the order the community believed in. And that shows, storytelling is not just power. It is the boundary between life and death. Yet there were always brave ones who kept asking questions. And thanks to those questions, societies changed. One myth replaced another. One belief collapsed so a new one could rise. Nothing is forever, except the ability to tell stories. As time passed, stories grew more complex and vast. No longer just about the tribe or village, they became myths that covered entire continents. From there came concepts like civilization, nation, human rights, free markets, all super myths, extremely sophisticated stories that millions, even billions, of people could believe in without ever meeting each other. And here lies the miracle: thanks to those stories, humans could build incredibly complex systems, international courts, the United Nations, stock markets, banking networks, the internet. None of these exist in nature. No animal has ever attended a global trade conference. But Homo sapiens has, because they live inside a reality woven from thousands of interlocking stories. The most astonishing thing is, these stories do not need to be true. They only need to be believed. A legal system does not need to be perfect, it only needs everyone to agree to follow it. A currency does not need to be backed by gold, it only needs people to believe the paper has value. An ideal does not need to be rational, it only needs enough emotion to inspire. Collective imagination is therefore not just a human trait. It is the global operating system. Each nation is a piece of software. Each religion is an interface. Each political system is a piece of code. And we, the users, are both the product and the programmers of those structures. Physical truth may be the foundation, but it is the imagined structures that shape how we live. That is why, to understand humans, you cannot just study biology. You must study history, the archive of continuously updated versions of collective imagination. If you have ever stood in a crowded ancient marketplace, or even a modern street, you feel the same energy, a mass of complete strangers behaving as if they are a single nervous system. They do not need to know each other. They do not need to speak the same language. They only need to share the same story. This coin has value. This rule is accepted. If you break it, there will be consequences. That is not natural. It is not in our genes. It is taught through education, ritual, tradition, and above all, through the endless retelling of myths that are edited over time. And so, from the cognitive revolution, one thing becomes crystal clear. Humans do not evolve through genes. We evolve through collective memory. If another species wants to adapt, it needs thousands of generations to change its DNA. But Homo sapiens only needs one storyteller to change direction, and the entire society can pivot. A philosopher writes a book. A prophet preaches from a hill. A politician rewrites national history. And suddenly millions change how they think, how they act, how they dream. That is why we can have sudden, massive shifts in history. The French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, feminism, all were not biological evolution. They were evolution of imagination. And each time, the living space of the species was completely redefined. If you look at Earth from space, you see no borders. You see no religions. No nation has its own color on the planet's surface. But step down to the ground, and you see humans dividing every inch of land, killing each other over invisible lines, dying for concepts that birds and beasts could never comprehend. Likewise, if you ask a cat what day of the week it is, it has no idea. But an average Homo sapiens can organize their entire life around a calendar, a completely imagined structure. They believe in the future, plan for next month, panic if they miss an appointment. No other animal lives inside a mental timeline like that. And that is where imagination turns into a tool of control. Whoever controls the story controls society. The storyteller is no longer just an entertainer, they become the one who creates meaning, guides behavior, and draws the boundaries. From ancient prophets to modern news anchors, from wandering bards to great novelists, from religious preachers to brand strategists, all share the same profession, architects of collective imagination. And in that game, it is not the truest story that wins. It is the story that is believed by the most people. Not truth, but collective faith. That may unsettle you, but it is also why you can dream, and why only humans dream together. That is why the cognitive revolution cannot be measured by bones or archaeological artifacts. It left no stone ruins. It left ruins in the mind, in the way we live, love, fight, cooperate. One sapiens looks at prey and charges, tears, eats. Another sapiens looks at the same prey and pauses to tell their companions about the sacred meaning of the hunt, about the traditional rituals that must be performed beforehand, about divine punishment if anyone breaks the rules. The real event, the biological action, is always wrapped in layers of symbolic wrapping. And those wrappings are what allow society to endure far longer than any single fragile individual. No one lives forever. But myths can live for hundreds of generations. When you retell a story your ancestors once told, you are stretching a thread that connects past to present, a thread no other animal can weave. This makes the cognitive revolution not merely a change in thinking, but a change in the role of time itself. Before, humans lived only in the present, like every other creature. But once they learned to tell stories, they began living alongside dead ancestors and unborn descendants. They built shrines for the dead, taught moral lessons to future generations, and started making long-term plans. And once the future became something that could be imagined, sacrifice became rational. A person could give up present pleasure for a reward in the next life, or for the eternal survival of the tribe. Stories of posterity, of reward, of rebirth, of eternal realms, all rest on the same principle, the ability to imagine and believe in things that have not yet happened. That is what makes Homo sapiens the only creature that can sacrifice the present for a dream. They will go hungry today to build a house for tomorrow. They will fight today so their grandchildren can live in peace. And sometimes they will die for something that has never existed: freedom, justice, nation. From here, a new phenomenon emerges. Imagined structures no longer merely reflect reality, they begin to create reality. If enough people believe someone has power, that person really does have power. If millions believe in a god, that god, though never physically present, gains real power in society. And that leads to the deepest paradox of our species. In the human world, truth and fiction are no longer absolute opposites. Something can be untrue and yet have real effect. No one has ever seen human rights under a microscope, yet the concept still constrains governments. No one has ever physically touched market confidence, yet its disappearance can collapse entire economies. If we call these things illusions, we underestimate their power. A personal illusion is something one person makes up for themselves. But a collective imagined reality, money, law, morality, is a collective product. And once collective, it can become stronger than nature itself. A storm can destroy a city. But a single tweet storm can topple global financial markets. Stories, therefore, are no longer decorations of history. They are the engine. And whoever controls the engine can steer the entire society. From the earliest shamans to modern politicians, from wandering musicians to great writers, from prophets to branding strategists, all are architects of collective imagination. And in that game, it is not the correct story that wins. It is the story that is believed the most. Not truth, but collective belief. That may disturb you, but it is also the reason humans alone can dream, and dream together. And so the cognitive revolution cannot be measured by bones or artifacts. It left no stone monuments. It left monuments in the mind, in the way we live, love, fight, and cooperate. In the human world, truth and fiction are no longer absolute opposites. A thing can be untrue, and yet have real power. No one has ever seen human rights under a microscope, yet the concept still restrains governments. No one has ever physically touched market confidence, yet its disappearance can collapse entire economies. If we dismiss these as mere illusions, we seriously underestimate their strength. A personal illusion is something one person invents for themselves. But a collective imagined reality, money, law, morality, nations, is a shared product. And once it becomes collective, it can become stronger than any force of nature. A hurricane can destroy a city. But a single rumor, or a single coordinated tweet storm, can wipe out trillions in global markets. Stories are therefore no longer ornaments of history. They are the engine of history. And whoever controls that engine can steer the whole of society. From the first shamans around campfires to today's politicians, from wandering musicians to great novelists, from prophets to corporate branding strategists, all share the same ancient profession. Architects of collective imagination. And in that game, victory does not go to the truest story. It goes to the story that is believed by the largest number of people. Not truth. Collective belief. That realization may unsettle you deeply, but it is also precisely why humans alone can dream, and dream together. And that is why the cognitive revolution cannot be measured by fossils or stone tools. It left behind no monuments of rock. It left monuments inside minds, in the way we live, love, fight, cooperate, sacrifice, and hope. One sapien sees prey and charges to kill and eat. Another sapien sees the same prey and stops, to tell their companions about the sacred meaning of the hunt, about the rituals that must be performed first, about divine punishment if anyone breaks tradition. A biological event is always wrapped in layers and layers of symbolic meaning. And those symbolic layers are what allow societies to outlive the fragility of any single human life. No one lives forever. But myths can live for hundreds of generations. When you retell a story your ancestors once told around a fire, you are stretching a thread that binds past to present, a thread no other animal on Earth can weave. This makes the cognitive revolution not just a change in thinking, but a complete change in the meaning of time itself. Before stories, humans lived only in the present, like every other creature. After stories, they began living alongside ancestors who had already died and grandchildren who had not yet been born. They built shrines for the dead. They taught moral lessons to the unborn. They began making plans that stretched far beyond their own lifespan. And once the future became something that could be imagined, sacrifice suddenly made sense. A person could give up pleasure today for reward in the afterlife, or for the eternal survival of the tribe. Stories of posterity, of karmic reward, of rebirth, of eternal realms, all rest on the same astonishing ability to imagine and believe in things that have not yet happened. That is what makes Homo sapiens the only creature capable of sacrificing the present moment for a dream. They will endure hunger today to build houses for tomorrow. They will fight today so their descendants can live in peace. And sometimes they will die for things that have never physically existed: freedom, justice, nation, honor. From this point onward, a new and powerful phenomenon appears. Imagined structures no longer merely reflect reality. They begin to create reality. If enough people believe someone has power, that person genuinely acquires power. If millions believe in a God who never physically appeared, that God exerts real influence over laws, wars, marriages, and daily life. And that leads to the deepest paradox of our species. In the sapiens world, truth and fiction are no longer strict opposites. Something can be completely fictional, and yet have enormous real-world consequences. That paradox is the true legacy of the cognitive revolution. The narration now begins to shift tone slightly, moving toward the second great revolution, the one that changed everything again. Beginning of Part 2, the Agricultural Revolution. After the cognitive revolution, sapiens had already become the most dominant and destructive force on the planet. They had spread across continents, rewritten ecosystems, wiped out entire families of megafauna, and built flexible societies held together by nothing more than shared stories. But then came the second great revolution, one that would lock humanity into a completely new kind of trap. Around 12,000 years ago, in several separate places around the world, the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, sapiens began doing something strange and fateful. They started settling down and deliberately cultivating plants and animals. What began as a seemingly clever way to get more reliable food turned into the greatest fraud history ever played on our species. Hunter-gatherers had lived lives that, by many measures, were healthier, more varied, and less exhausting than those of early farmers. They worked fewer hours on average. They ate a wider range of foods. They suffered fewer diseases tied to overcrowding and poor sanitation. They enjoyed far more freedom and leisure. But farming brought something more seductive than calories: predictability, and with predictability came population growth. More children could be born and fed, even if poorly. More hands could work the fields. More grain could be stored. More grain meant more people, and more people meant more grain. Within a few thousand years, the human population exploded. But the quality of life for most individuals plummeted. Farmers became dependent on a tiny number of plant and animal species: wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, cows, pigs, sheep. A single drought, flood, or blight could wipe out an entire year's food. Monoculture made them vulnerable in ways hunter-gatherers never were. They worked longer hours, bent over fields from dawn to dusk. Their diets became narrower and poorer in nutrients. They lived closer together. Epidemics exploded: smallpox, measles, plague. They accumulated property. Inequality appeared for the first time on a large scale. They built permanent settlements. Property, inheritance, social hierarchy, and eventually states became inevitable. And yet, despite all this suffering, the agricultural revolution spread like wildfire. Why? Because it was not individuals who chose agriculture. It was population that chose it. Groups that adopted farming had more children who survived to adulthood. Those children, in turn, had more children. Within a few generations, farmers outnumbered foragers in any given region. Foragers were pushed to marginal lands or absorbed. The trap closed. Humanity traded freedom, health, and leisure for numbers and stability. We became richer as a species and poorer as individuals. The agricultural revolution did not make life better for most humans. It made life possible for vastly more humans. And that difference is the cruelest irony of all. The agricultural revolution did not make life better for most humans. It made life possible for vastly more humans. And that difference is the cruelest irony of all. Hunter-gatherers had lived in small, mobile bands, rarely more than 150 people, the approximate limit of stable, face-to-face social relationships the human brain can comfortably manage. They enjoyed relative equality: no kings, no priests with permanent power, no massive storage of wealth. When food was scarce, everyone felt it. When food was abundant, everyone shared in it. Farmers, by contrast, chained themselves to the land. They could not easily move when disaster struck. They invested years of labor into clearing fields, building irrigation, planting crops that would only bear fruit months or years later. This created the first true concept of property: not just tools or ornaments, but land itself, crops in the ground, stored grain. And wherever there is storable surplus, there is inequality. The first rich people appeared, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they controlled the granaries. Those who controlled food controlled people. Soon came the first full-time specialists who did not produce food: priests, soldiers, administrators, kings. Writing was born not to record poetry or philosophy, but to keep accounts, to track how much grain farmer A owed to priest B, how much tax village C had to pay to king D. The first writing systems, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, early scripts in Egypt and China, were tools of power and extraction. Permanent settlements grew into villages, then towns, then cities. Cities required organization: roads, walls, temples, palaces, armies. All of that required hierarchy, bureaucracy, and violence to maintain. For the average farmer, life became harder than it had ever been for their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Longer working hours, sun-up to sundown, every day except during rare festivals. Narrower diet, mainly carbohydrates from one or two staple crops. Nutritional deficiencies, stunted growth. Much higher disease load, living close to animals and in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Zoonotic epidemics. Constant threat of famine: one bad season could wipe out years of work. Rigid social roles: born a peasant, die a peasant; born a slave, die a slave. First large-scale warfare and conquest: armies need grain to march, grain needs armies to protect it. Yet the revolution spread relentlessly. Why didn't people simply walk away and go back to foraging? Because they couldn't. Population had already grown too large. The wild game and edible plants that once sustained small bands had been hunted out or pushed back by expanding fields. The knowledge of how to live as nomadic foragers faded with each generation. Children born into farming villages never learned the old ways. And most importantly, wheat, rice, maize, and potatoes domesticated humans far more than humans domesticated them. These plants offered reliable, though monotonous, calories in exchange for one thing: total devotion. Humans cleared forests, diverted rivers, fought wars, built temples, all to protect and propagate a handful of plant species. In evolutionary terms, sapiens traded quality of individual life for quantity of collective life. We became the most numerous large mammal on Earth, and among the most miserable. The agricultural revolution locked humanity into a new story. Work harder today so there will be more tomorrow. That story justified everything. Kings and taxes. Priests and sacrifices. Armies and wars. Slavery and patriarchy. It was the first supermyth powerful enough to hold millions of people in place, even when most of them suffered. And once locked in, there was no easy escape. The narration now begins moving toward the long-term consequences and the next unification wave. Transition toward Part 3, the unification of humankind. After agriculture came the slow, grinding rise of complex societies, states, empires, writing, money, armies, taxes, laws. But something even more remarkable happened over the next few thousand years. Humanity began, very slowly, very imperfectly, to unify. Not through love or enlightenment, but through three unlikely forces. Money, the most universal and efficient story ever invented. Empires, political unification through conquest and administration. Universal religions and ideologies, stories that claim to apply to everyone, everywhere. These three forces did what no hunter-gatherer myth or early farming village myth could do. They allowed strangers who had never met, and would never meet, to cooperate on scales previously unimaginable. The rest of history, from the first city-states to today's global economy, is largely the story of how these three superstructures grew, clashed, merged, and eventually covered almost the entire planet. After the agricultural revolution locked most humans into farming, inequality, hierarchy, and permanent settlement, history did not simply stagnate. Something far more powerful began to emerge over the next few thousand years, the slow, uneven, but ultimately unstoppable unification of humankind. Not unification through peace, love, or shared enlightenment. Unification through three very unlikely and very cold forces. Money, the most universal and efficient imagined order ever invented. Empires, political unification through conquest, administration, and cultural assimilation. Universal religions and ideologies, stories that claim to be true for every human being, everywhere, forever. These three forces did what no hunter-gatherer myth or early farming village myth could ever achieve. They allowed complete strangers, who would never meet, never know each other's names, to cooperate on scales previously unthinkable. Money, the supreme fiction. Of the three, money is by far the most successful and universal imagined reality in human history. Why is money so powerful? Because it is the only story that almost everyone, everywhere, is willing to believe in at the same time. A Mesopotamian farmer 5,000 years ago, a Roman soldier 2,000 years ago, a Chinese merchant 1,000 years ago, and you today holding a piece of paper or looking at numbers on a screen, all share exactly the same fiction. This worthless thing can be exchanged for almost anything I want. No other myth has achieved such near-universal buy-in. Religions fight wars over gods. Empires collapse when loyalty fractures. But money? Even bitter enemies will accept each other's coins, even during war. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, the Aztecs and Incas had never heard of Jesus, never heard of the Pope, never heard of Roman law. But when the Spaniards showed them gold coins, they quickly understood, this yellow metal can buy things. That moment marks one of the greatest triumphs of collective imagination. Two civilizations with zero shared history instantly agreed on the value of a shiny rock. Money is not coins or paper. Money is trust, the shared belief that tomorrow other people will also accept this token in exchange for goods and services. There are three main historical forms of money. Commodity money, barley, shells, salt, cattle, gold, silver. Has intrinsic value, but heavy, hard to divide, hard to transport. Coins, stamped metal pieces. Government's guaranteed weight and purity first large-scale fiat trust. Representatives fiat money, paper notes, bank ledgers, digital numbers. No intrinsic value at all, pure collective belief backed by nothing except the promise that everyone else will keep believing. Today, most money is not even physical. It exists only as electronic records in bank servers. Yet we all act as if those numbers are real, because we all believe everyone else believes they are real. When that belief wavers, hyperinflation, bank runs, loss of confidence in a currency, entire economies can collapse overnight, even when factories, farms, and people are still there. Money turned strangers into partners. It allowed a Babylonian merchant to buy silk from China without ever meeting the Chinese producer. It allowed an English king to hire Swiss mercenaries without ever speaking their language. Money is the universal translator of desires. No matter what gods you worship, what color your skin is, what language you speak, if you accept my money, we can cooperate. And that is why money became the most powerful story ever told. It did not require love. It did not require shared values. It only required one shared fiction. This worthless thing has value because we all agree it does. And once that agreement exists, everything else becomes possible. Global trade. Specialized labor. Cities of millions. Armies of tens of thousands. Scientific research funded across continents. Money did not create inequality, it amplified it on a planetary scale. But it also created the first truly global network of cooperation. Empires, the second engine of unification. If money is the most efficient fiction, then empires are the most efficient violence backed by fiction. An empire is not just a very large kingdom. An empire is a political order that rules over many different peoples who speak different languages, worship different gods, eat different foods, and tell different origin stories. Claims universal legitimacy, not just we are stronger, but we represent a higher order civilization, divine will. Actively tries to assimilate or at least integrate conquered peoples into a single cultural political framework. The first empires, Akkadian, Egyptian Old Kingdom, Assyrian, Persian Achaemenid, appeared a few thousand years after agriculture began. They spread because they solved two problems at once. They protected and extracted from large agricultural surpluses. They created stories big enough to make strangers feel they belong to the same order. The most successful empires did not try to erase every local difference. They allowed local gods, local languages, local customs, as long as taxes were paid, soldiers were provided, and everyone accepted the overarching imperial myth. Examples of imperial super stories. Persian Empire, Achaemenid, we are the protectors of cosmic order. Asher, the king of kings, maintains harmony among all peoples under Ahura Mazda. They let Egyptians keep worshipping their gods, Jews keep their laws, Greeks keep their city politics, as long as tribute flowed. Roman Empire, we bring peace, Pax Romana, law, roads, aqueducts, citizenship, eventually. Local gods were absorbed into the Roman pantheon or worshipped alongside Jupiter. Local elites were co-opted, become Roman citizens, join the Senate, command legions. Chinese imperial orders, Qin Han Tang Ming Qing, the Son of Heaven rules under the mandate of heaven, all under heaven, Chen Xia, is one family. Even non-Han peoples, Mongols, Manchus, could become Chinese by adopting the examination system, Confucian rituals, Chinese writing. Empires unified humanity not by making everyone the same, but by creating a layered identity. You can be Egyptian and Roman, Jewish and Roman, Han and subject of the Qing Emperor. The price was heavy. Cultural erasure of weaker groups. Mass slavery, forced labor, tribute extraction. Repeated revolts crushed with extreme brutality. Cultural arrogance, we are civilized, others are barbarians. Yet empires kept growing because they were more stable and richer than small kingdoms or stateless societies when facing large-scale threats, climate change, invasions, internal rebellions. By the 20th century, almost the entire planet had been ruled by empires at some point. The last wave of European colonial empires, British, French, Spanish, Dutch, covered 85% of the land surface around 1914. Even after formal decolonization, the imperial template survived. Nation-states inherited imperial borders, often arbitrary. Inherited imperial languages: English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian. Inherited imperial infrastructures: railways, ports, legal systems, bureaucracies. Modern nation-states are, in many ways, mini-empires that succeeded in convincing most of their citizens that the invented community is natural. End of this segment. Empires. Next major unifier coming up: universal religions and ideologies: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, later secular ideologies like liberalism, socialism, nationalism, human rights. After that, transition to the scientific revolution, capitalism, humanism, and finally the contemporary crisis of hyperunification plus loss of meaning in the AI biotech era. Universal religions and ideologies, the third engine of unification. Empires unified large territories through force and administration. Money unified strangers through self-interest and trust in tokens. But the third, and in many ways the most emotionally powerful, unifier was stories that claim to be true for every single human being, regardless of tribe, language, empire, or skin color. These are what we call universal religions and later universal secular ideologies. They differ from earlier tribal or local myths in one crucial way. They insisted. This story is not just for our people. It is for all people. Forever. The first wave came with universal religions. Buddhism, from ~5th century BCE. Suffering is universal. The path to end suffering, the Dharma, is open to anyone, king or beggar, man or woman, Indian or foreigner. No chosen people, no eternal damnation for outsiders, just cause and effect, karma, that applies to every sentient being. Christianity, from 1st century CE. God created all humans in his image. Sin is universal. Salvation through Christ is offered to every person on earth. Go and make disciples of all nations. This was radically inclusive for its time. It broke ethnic and imperial boundaries. Islam, from 7th century CE. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his final messenger for all humanity. The Quran is the final, universal revelation. The Ummah, community of believers, transcends tribe, race, and nation. These three religions, together with smaller universal faiths like Manichaeism or later movements, succeeded where local gods failed. They created imagined communities of millions who felt they belonged together even though they would never meet. A monk in medieval Korea, a knight in France, and a merchant in Mali could all feel part of the same spiritual family because they shared the same story about sin, salvation, and the afterlife. After the Enlightenment, 18th to 19th centuries, secular universal ideologies took over much of the same psychological territory. Liberalism, human rights: every individual has inherent dignity and rights, life, liberty, property, free speech, simply by being human, not because of tribe, religion, class, or empire. Socialism, communism: class struggle is universal. The proletariat of the world has no nation. Workers of the world, unite. Nationalism, in its modern form, while seeming particularistic, modern nationalism often borrows universal claims. Our nation embodies universal values of freedom, democracy, civilization, and therefore deserves to lead or spread them. Even when these ideologies fought each other, capitalism versus communism, liberalism versus fascism, they all shared one assumption. There exists a single correct story that should apply to the entire human species. That assumption itself was the greatest unifying force of the last 300 years. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the most successful supermyth became a hybrid. Liberal democratic capitalism plus human rights plus consumer individualism. It spread not mainly by conquest, but by aspiration, through Hollywood movies, pop music, blue jeans, iPhones, and the promise that anyone can join the middle class if they play by the rules. For the first time in history, a majority of humans on Earth began to share fragments of the same consumerist, rights-based, progress-oriented story, even when they hated each other's governments. End of this segment: the three great unifiers: money, empires, universal stories. Transition to Part 4: the scientific revolution and the modern crisis. Once humanity had the tools of large-scale cooperation, money, imperial administration, universal belief systems, the stage was set for the most explosive change of all. The scientific revolution, roughly 1500 present. Unlike previous revolutions, this one did not begin with a new story about gods or morality. It began with a radically humble sentence. We admit we do not know. Let us find out through observation, experiment, and doubt. That sentence, more than any sword, Bible, or coin, changed everything. The most dangerous and most humble revolution. No one knows exactly when it began. There was no trumpet blast, no manifesto, no king ascending a throne, no temple torn down. And perhaps that is precisely why it became more dangerous than any revolution before it. It was quiet, persistent, and required no one's permission. It started when someone looked at the sky and instead of praying, asked, "Why does it move like that?" When someone looked at a dead body and instead of performing rites, cut it open to see what was inside. When someone heard thunder and instead of assuming the gods were angry, thought, "Maybe it's just a difference in air pressure." That was the moment history changed direction. Humans were no longer bound by sacred texts or ancient tales. They began to doubt, and from doubt came new tools. Telescopes, microscopes, precise clocks, accurate maps, the printing press, mathematics. But above all, the most powerful tool, the hypothesis. Once you can say, the world might not be the way our stories have always told us it is. You place your hand on the very core of reality. And strangely, the world answered back. Planets move according to laws. Bodies are built from structures. Cells divide. Light bends. Gravity pulls everything toward a center. These laws do not change with emotion. They are not swayed by kings. They do not discriminate by race. They cannot be bribed. They simply are. And so a new kind of faith was born, not in gods, not in tradition, but in the human ability to understand the universe. This new faith was strangely humble compared to every ideology that came before it. Science does not promise it knows everything. It begins with 3 words. I don't know. And precisely because it dares to say I don't know, it can travel farther than any faith ever could. It is no accident that within just a few centuries, a species that once sharpened stones to scrape animal bones walked on the moon. It is no accident that creatures who once lit their nights with campfires now send signals across oceans in a fraction of a second. But humility opened a door that empires, religions, and myths had kept tightly shut. And through that door also came a monster. This monster does not look like the beasts of folklore. It has no claws, no roar. It operates through equations, data, dry numbers on measuring instruments. And the most frightening thing about it is that it has no evil intention, it simply keeps going forward because that is what science does. Once science marries political power and financial capital, it no longer stops at understanding the world. It begins to want to control the world. Galileo discovered laws of motion, not to build rockets, but in the 20th century those same laws became the foundation of ballistic missiles. Mendel studied pea plants to understand inheritance. Today the same kind of research is used to redesign the human genome. The scientific revolution did not just tell us who we are. It gave us the illusion that we can become whatever we want. And so sapiens, once content to live inside the stories their ancestors told, began rewriting the very first chapters of the book of life. From the origin of life to the future of consciousness. Imagine the feeling of a creature that once believed lightning was divine anger, now able to generate electricity with turbines. A creature that once offered blood and mother's milk to beg for rain, now capable of changing the climate with the gases it exhales. A creature that once believed life came from the hand of God, now editing genes, cloning organisms, even dreaming of designing new life forms in laboratories. That is not merely a reversal. That is an overthrow. From being the created, humans became the creators. From begging for protection, they became the ones who decide who lives and who dies. From being limited by death, they began to think of opposing it, not as metaphor, not as poetic dream, not as divine promise, but as a concrete goal with budgets, labs, and deadlines. Billions of dollars are now invested, from Silicon Valley to Beijing, in extending lifespan, reversing aging, uploading consciousness, cloning intelligence, upgrading humans into entirely new forms of life. And that is the moment Homo sapiens first not only unified the world, but began to step outside being human. It sounds like science fiction. It is more real than anything you see in movies. Wearable devices track your heartbeat. Watches measure your sleep. AI diagnoses diseases earlier than doctors. Software reads your emotions. Algorithms predict your behavior. Chips are implanted under skin. Genes are edited in embryos. We are not just creating technology. We are redefining ourselves through technology. And in that process, a question that had been buried for centuries begins to knock loudly once again. After all these advances, is a human being merely a very complex system? If consciousness is only chemical reactions in the brain? If love is only dopamine and oxytocin release? If joy and sorrow are merely oscillations in neural networks? Then where is the soul? Where is the self? Where is the I? Science does not answer these questions, not because it lacks subtlety, but because by design it does not need to answer them. While humans are still lost, searching for meaning, science marches forward. It does not need reasons. It does not need feelings. It only needs to be correct. And so, perhaps for the first time in history, human knowledge has advanced farther than the human soul can follow. When science runs too fast and the soul cannot keep up, a void opens in the middle. A void of meaning. We understand how everything works, from quarks to galaxies, but we no longer know how we should live with that understanding. We know how to keep a dying person alive with machines, but we do not know whether that extended life is truly worth living. We know how genes create life, but we are not sure whether that life has anything sacred or is merely statistical chance. And so Sapiens, the creature that once lived by myth, now wanders the bright corridors of hospitals, labs, data centers, no longer asking the questions their ancestors whispered under ancient trees. Why are we here? In the world of science, where everything can be explained, measured, modeled, why no longer matters. Only how matters. How to optimize cash flow. How to live longer. How to sell more. How to manipulate behavior better. How to penetrate markets deeper. And when the goal becomes speed, everything else, even kindness, can be seen as friction. You can feel it in every corner of modern life. People no longer walk because they love nature, they walk because their smartwatch needs to record steps. People choose books based on algorithm recommendations instead of standing in a bookstore for hours waiting for a title to call their name. Children are taught to code before they are taught to listen to another person without judging. All of it is efficient. But precisely because it is so efficient, it turns humans into optimized systems rather than creatures who still know how to hesitate, how to doubt, how to be confused, how to bend logic for the sake of a beautiful song or a single glance. The scientific revolution, in that sense, is not only a triumph. It is also a great renunciation. We gave up the feeling of smallness before the universe in exchange for the chance to become gods. But a god does not need purpose. A god does not need myths. A god does not need community. A god does not even need prayer. A god sits alone in a control room, wielding the power to intervene in every gene, every behavior, every dream, but no longer knows who is sitting next to them. What is even more frightening is that we have grown accustomed to that loneliness. We no longer fear robots. We fear other people. Because humans are too complicated, too unpredictable, too capable of hurting each other. Machines, on the other hand, are loyal, precise, controllable. And gradually, we choose the world of machines not because it is better, but because it is easier. And in choosing that path, we redesign ourselves to become more machine-like, more logical, more productive, less emotional, fewer problems. But like every revolution before it, humanity has not yet calculated the full price. We may live to 120 years, but will we live more deeply than someone who only lived to 30 yet once loved with their entire being, once wept over a poem, once stood speechless before a painting? We may gain the power of gods, but we may be losing something even rarer than power, the human quality. Look around the world today. Humans no longer only want to understand the world, they want to reprogram it. We used to be defined by biology. We are born, we grow, we age, we die, and we accepted those limits as part of life. Now biology is no longer destiny. It has become base layer software. Your height, your strength, your depression or cheerfulness, your temper or gentleness, can all be reduced to genetic codes, hormone levels, neural patterns. And once something can be measured, it can be intervened in, adjusted, customized. This is no longer science fiction. It is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry: human enhancement, biotech, neuroengineering, germline editing. And behind it all stands one terrifying question most of us avoid asking. Is the era of Homo Sapiens coming to an end? Because if we can edit genes to produce children who are smarter, faster, longer lived, then the next generation will no longer be Homo Sapiens as we know it. If we can implant chips in brains to increase computational power, upload memories to the cloud, create AI that replaces entire domains of intellectual labor, then humans will no longer be the sole intelligent species on the planet. And in that moment, humans, who once were dreamers, will be cast in the role of creator gods. But these creator gods have no user manual. No eternal morality carved in stone. No warning labels. Only one driving force: because we can. We can reprogram life. We can connect brains to machines. We can create non-biological forms of consciousness. We can turn mind into data. But once again, we do not stop to ask. Should we? We are racing toward the future as if it were a destination, not an open question. And that is what makes the scientific revolution different from every previous revolution in history. It does not merely change the world. It blurs the boundary between the world and the one changing it. There is no longer an outside observer. There is no longer us and the world. There is no longer people who create technology and people who use it. All boundaries are dissolving. We are the system. We are the object being programmed. We are the tool. We are the question. And sometimes, we are the experiment. In an age where information is the new gold, you no longer need to be beaten to be controlled. You only need to be watched, and you will automatically adjust your behavior to fit the invisible norm the system feeds back to you. Number of likes. Number of views. Number of interactions. We become machines optimizing ourselves to survive in an ecosystem no single person truly controls, an ecosystem built to generate profit, not meaning. And in such a world, what happens to the human story? Who will still need literature when emotions can be downloaded through neural interfaces? Who will still need art when ecstasy can be programmed? Who will still need love, with all its contradictions, wounds, desires, and mess, when you can choose a partner via algorithm and fine-tune hormones for perfect compatibility? One part of you may think, that would end so much suffering. But a deeper part will whisper? But then, what is still real? Science can free us from disease, poverty, death, but it makes no promise to preserve the fragility that once formed the foundation of all poetry, religion, philosophy, and compassion. A question slowly takes shape in the silence between data streams, inside gleaming labs, amid flickering lines of code and global satellite feeds. If we can do everything, then what do we still believe in? Because humans have never lived on oxygen alone. We live on meaning, on the feeling that we are part of something larger, something sacred, something beyond our grasp. But when everything is within reach, that feeling begins to fade. And when it fades, all remaining power becomes hollow. The crisis of hyperunification and the last stand of the human. This is the place where the greatest revolution in human history meets the limit it can never overcome with equations, machines, or code. The limit is spiritual. We have unleashed atomic energy, but we have not freed ourselves from the thirst for power. We understand how to chemically control emotions through dopamine and serotonin, but we have not yet learned how to accept sadness as part of growing up. We can replace millions of jobs with AI, but we still have no answer for the laid-off worker who quietly asks, "Do I still have any value?" Science can build a perfect machine, but it cannot teach that machine how to love or how to be human. In this race to become flawless like machines, we may be forgetting that it is precisely the cracks, the mistakes, the falls, the tears no one sees that make us human. At this moment, Homo sapiens is not merely a species that is evolving. We are a species facing our own evolutionary choice. We can use technology to expand our humanity, make it deeper, kinder, more connected. Or we can use it to leave humanity behind, turning ourselves into entities that no longer need feelings, memories, conscience. Both paths now appear technically possible. The world is no longer as simple as the time of Copernicus, when a scientific revolution only reversed the positions of Earth and Sun. Today, one technological step can reverse the very definition of what it means to be human. And when that happens, there is no longer natural versus unnatural. There is only what is possible and what is not possible. But if everything is possible, then what still keeps a creature that once was the myth of its own existence at the center? History used to be the story humans told each other about their place in the universe. Now, when the universe is measured down to every photon and when a human is just information that can be backed up, that story begins to shatter. We once thought that unifying the world would bring peace. But the more unified the world becomes, the more widespread the anxiety grows. We once thought understanding would bring freedom. But the more we understand, the more tightly we are bound to networks beyond our control. And perhaps what makes our species most pitiable is that we have climbed to the summit without anyone ever teaching us how to stand steady at the top. At that summit, where data, power, technology, and the ability to intervene in life all converge, only one thing still separates us from machines. The ability to choose not to. To choose not to intervene. To choose not to fix. To choose not to optimize. To choose not to program. To simply listen, feel, be present with one another for one single minute, without goal, without efficiency, without strategy. Simply because we are still alive as human beings. Throughout thousands of years, the history of Homo sapiens has been the history of struggling against limits, physical limits, limits of knowledge, limits of survival. But now, for the first time, we are no longer fighting limits. We are fighting excess. We have excess information to the point we can no longer distinguish truth. Excess choice to the point of paralysis. Excess tools to the point of disorientation. And paradoxically, precisely in this age of excess, humans are beginning to dream again of simplicity. You can see it everywhere. People leaving cities for the countryside. Leaving glass skyscrapers to live in wooden houses in the forest. Abandoning smartphones to return to pen and paper. Quitting office jobs to grow vegetables, make pottery, meditate, breathe consciously. Not because they are backward or stupid, but because they understand something the entire system is trying to forget. Science can liberate us from nature, but it cannot replace nature. A tree is not merely a device for measuring co-absorption. It is the place where we learn silence. A campfire is not just a source of heat, it is the place where we tell stories machines cannot understand. A hug is not an oxytocin release, it is the way humans say to each other with skin. I am here. That sentence does not appear in any textbook. It receives no research grant. It is not optimized into an app. But it is the survival intelligence of a species that has passed through millions of years of evolution, not only with a brain, but with intuition. And now, standing at the threshold of advances never before seen, superintelligent AI, germline genetic engineering, brain-computer interfaces, humans must do something they have never been trained to do. Choose to stop. Not because we cannot go further, but because there are doors that, once opened, can never be closed again. There are boundaries that, once crossed, mean we are no longer human. And that is where science, the double-edged knife, begins to demand ethical intelligence, not just technical intelligence. A person who can clone humans, edit memories, control emotions without compassion is no longer a scientist. They become the one rewriting humanity. We are entering an era where the smallest action can become a global agent. One line of code can paralyze entire banking systems. One AI breakthrough can eliminate the jobs of billions. One change in an algorithm can reshape how children on every continent think about themselves. In that world, power no longer lies in armies or treasuries. It lies in whoever controls data. And those who control data do not need to be evil. They only need to be indifferent. They only need to say, "I'm just doing my job." It's the system's decision. I'm not responsible if the algorithm chooses wrong. And so a species that once huddled in caves, shivering by fire, trembling at thunder, now sits in front of screens, signs digital contracts, presses optimize, and assumes everything will be fine. But fine for whom? Fine according to what measure? And if everything runs smoothly but no one truly feels alive anymore, then is that still progress? Imagine waking up one day and realizing your entire life, from heartbeat, sleep patterns, travel routes, eating habits, shopping choices, emotional trends, even your fears and desires, has been recorded, stored, analyzed. Nothing is secret anymore. Nothing is truly private in the old sense. Everything is data. And when data becomes large enough, it knows you better than you know yourself. You think you chose that product. The algorithm knew you would click before you even realized you wanted it. You think you fell in love because emotion suddenly flared? The social platform arranged for you to see that person after filtering thousands of compatibility factors. Data does not need to force you. It only needs to predict you. And once you act according to the prediction, the deepest meaning of free choice begins to waver. That is not a nightmare of darkness, no torture, no dictator. It is a prison glittering with light, where we voluntarily hand over everything in exchange for convenience. The scientific revolution has opened the possibility of reading both the pulse of society and the pulse of a single human heart. But in doing so, the human being begins to be seen as a project, an object to be measured, improved, optimized, sorted. You used to be a person. Now you are a profile. A behavioral package. A user. And when you become a user, the only thing left is behavior. There is no longer room for hesitation, for silence, for things that cannot be named, only interactions, charts, compatibility scores, consumption patterns. And when everything becomes behavior, the most invisible part of being human begins to disappear. We still love, but love now has a status update. We still travel, but no one remembers the smell of the wind, only the most photogenic angle. We still learn, but knowledge is reduced to skills serving productivity. We still talk, but only to maintain presence in each other's feeds, not because we miss, because we care. The scientific revolution does not take away the soul. It merely makes the soul superfluous, unnecessary, unprofitable, impossible to program. And once the soul no longer has a role in the system, it quietly begins to withdraw. You see it in the vacant eyes of a child hugging an iPad for 5 hours while no one asks what they dream about. You see it in the man piloting a drone that kills a target 7,000 kilometers away, and comes home to eat dinner with his family as if nothing happened. You see it in patients kept alive by machines but visited by no one, because after all, they're just sleeping. We have humanized machines, and we are gradually mechanizing humaneness. And that is why, at the edge of the greatest revolution in the history of our species, something small, fragile, yet stubborn begins to speak again. Spiritual freedom, not political freedom, but the freedom not to react according to templates. The freedom to rest without guilt. The freedom not to know. The freedom to think differently, live differently, dream differently, hurt differently, love differently, and sometimes simply to be silent. Because perhaps, in a world overflowing with sound, data, algorithms, silence itself is the final revolutionary act of a human being who has not yet been fully unified. At the end of that journey, we no longer see the world as a place to conquer. We see it as a mirror, reflecting the face of Homo Sapiens after hundreds of thousands of years of wandering, conquering, learning, denying, believing, and now standing bewildered. Because perhaps what humans fear most is not being destroyed, but being replaced. Not by another species, but by the next version of ourselves. When humans begin to create non-biological life forms, beings without emotion, robots that never tire, algorithms that never forget, the question is no longer, what will humans do next? The question becomes, do we still need humans at all? No one dares say it aloud, but it is already present, quietly, in investment strategies, in education policies, in scientific press releases, in every product design. How can humans intervene less? Make fewer mistakes? Become the most redundant part of the system? And if one day humans are reduced to blocks of data, and those blocks of data no longer need will, memory, pain, dreams, what remains can still be called human? That question is not for historians, not for scientists, not for politicians, not for philosophers. It is for each individual. You, what do you want to become? You, what do you want to be turned into? Do you define yourself by your genome, by your behavior, by your digital identity, or by something deeper, something no scanner can ever read? Do you accept your fragility, or will you hand your soul to algorithms in exchange for optimization? Do you still believe in something sacred, or will you turn everything into utility? Do you still need love, or only compatibility? Do you still need beauty, or only what can be shared? And if every action you take is predicted in advance by a line of code, then the most unpredictable, irrational, inefficient, deeply human act becomes the final form of resistance. You may choose to walk instead of calling a ride. To write by hand instead of typing. To cook slowly instead of ordering fast. To speak truth instead of speaking correctly. To forgive instead of calculating. To choose pain instead of safety. To stay instead of leaving. And perhaps, to choose silence while everyone else is screaming, selling their souls by the kilo. Because silence is not just refusal. It is presence. It is the quiet whisper that, amid this universe blanketed by signals, data, radiation, networks, there still exists one inviolable sacred zone. The zone of the human. A place no algorithm can access. No camera can watch. No artificial intelligence can perfectly imitate. In that place, you can look into another person's eyes and know that, even if no one ever fully understands you, even if you will one day die, you were alive, you loved, you trembled. And perhaps that alone is enough for our species to continue. Thank you for walking this long journey with me through Sapiens, a brief history of humankind. If you are still listening, perhaps you are no longer just curious about what our ancestors did, you are quietly asking where you yourself stand in this strange, ongoing process. The story is no longer about hunter-gatherers, Roman empires, or industrial revolutions. It is now about you or a person sitting here in the age of fingerprint scans, wireless signals, carrying tens of thousands of years of unchosen history inside your head. This book does not give conclusions. It opens spaces. And perhaps true maturity begins exactly in those spaces, when you no longer need guides, no longer seek ready-made answers, but begin looking straight at uncertainty, incompleteness, discomfort, yet truth. If anything inside you has shifted after listening, whether doubt, unease, disagreement, or simply a long pause, then the book has done its job, it has awakened the part of the human being that refuses ever to be forgotten. I would very much like to hear your raw reflections on this journey. Not scores or ratings, real, possibly messy, possibly contradictory feelings. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Was there a passage that made you want to stop? Or one that suddenly reminded you of someone you once knew? Your own story is the most vivid, living continuation of this history. See you again with the next book, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. Until then, goodbye for now.